Hello, and welcome back to Beyond the Swedish Postcard. If you are joining for the first time, I am really glad you are here. This podcast explores Sweden beyond the image many people see from the outside. Sometimes that means talking about everyday life here, and sometimes it means traveling thousands of years into the past. Today, we're doing exactly that. So, wherever you are listening from, take a moment and imagine Scandinavia. Imagine long stretches of forest broken by rivers and lakes. Imagine granite cliffs meeting the sea. Imagine cold wind moving across open water. Now, imagine this landscape more than 2,000 years ago. No cities, no roads, no written language, just scattered farms, longhouses glowing with firelight in the darkness, and stories passed from one generation to the next. Today, we are stepping into the Iron Age of Scandinavia. Around 500 BC, Scandinavia begins transitioning into the Iron Age. For centuries before this, bronze defined power. Bronze swords, bronze ornaments, bronze tools. But bronze required tin, and tin was rare in Scandinavia. Communities depended on long trade routes stretching across Europe to obtain the materials needed to make bronze. Iron changed that. Iron ore existed locally. Across Scandinavia, iron could be found forming naturally in wetlands as bog iron. Iron-rich groundwater would seep upward into marshy areas and oxidize, leaving deposits that people could harvest. These deposits were dug from the earth and smelted in small clay furnaces. Archaeologists across Sweden have discovered the traces of this process: slag heaps, fragments of furnaces hardened by fire, and iron blooms, the spongy metal produced during early smelting. Iron production required skill, but it allowed communities to produce tools closer to home. Iron axes cleared forests, iron knives shaped wood and leather, iron tools became part of daily life. Slowly, the structure of society began shifting. Now, remember something we talked about in the last episode. During the Bronze Age, the sea was everything: ships carved into rock, stone ships set into the earth, trade routes stretching across the Baltic. Life moved along the coastline and across the water. The sea was power. But as we move into the Iron Age, the landscape begins to shift in another way, not just socially, geologically, because the land itself was still moving. During the Ice Age, massive glaciers pressed down on northern Europe like an enormous weight. When those glaciers melted, the pressure lifted and the land slowly began rising again. This process is called post glacial rebound. Even today, parts of Sweden are still rising a little bit every year, but during the Iron Age, that change would have been easier to notice across generations. Coastlines gradually moved outward. New land slowly appeared along the edges of the sea. Places that were once shallow bays became wetlands. Wetlands became meadows and eventually forests. So the geography of Scandinavia during the Iron Age was not exactly the same as the one we see today. The region that would eventually become Stockholm was not yet a city. It was a scattered archipelago of rocky islands emerging from the Baltic Sea. Moving through this landscape almost always meant traveling by boat. Water was still the main road. On the west coast, where Gothenburg now stands, rivers spilled into the North Sea through wide estuaries filled with fish and seabirds. And farther south, near the narrow strait where Sweden touches Denmark, the waters around what is now Helsingborg formed one of the most important natural gateways in Northern Europe. Anyone moving between the Baltic Sea and the North Sea had to pass through that corridor. So even though Iron Age communities were becoming more rooted in farming and land-based settlements, the sea still connected everything. It always had. And in Scandinavia, it always would. Now, imagine approaching a settlement during the Iron Age. Smoke rises slowly above a cluster of wooden buildings. At the center stands a longhouse. These homes could stretch 30 meters long. Archaeologists identify them today through rows of post holes left in the soil. Inside the longhouse, a hearth burns in the center. The fire provides heat, light, and a place for cooking. Families sleep along the walls on wooden platforms covered with furs or woven blankets. During winter, animals are often kept inside in the same structure. Cattle, sheep, goats. Their warmth helps keep the building from freezing. Outside the longhouse are small fields. Barley grows here, rye, oats. Agriculture has become the foundation of daily life. Seasons shape everything. Planting in spring, grazing animals in summer, harvesting grain in the autumn, and surviving the long, dark winter. Across Sweden, archaeologists have discovered fortified hilltops known as hillforts. These sites are surrounded by stone walls and built on elevated terrain. From their heights, you can see valleys, rivers, and approaching travelers from miles away. Some hill forts may have served as refuges during conflict. Others likely acted as centers of local authority. Standing on one today, you can feel something immediately: visibility, control, the ability to watch the land. Iron Age Scandinavia was a landscape where communities protected what they had built. When we dig into the ground, we can uncover iron tools, fragments of pottery, the outlines of longhouses, and the stone walls of hill forts. We can see where people lived. We can see how they farmed the land, defended their communities, and moved through the landscape. But the soil cannot preserve the voices of the people who live there. And yet, those voices existed. Inside the longhouses we talked about earlier, when winter settled over Scandinavia and darkness stretched long into the night, people gathered around the central hearth. The fire burned low. Outside, the wind moved through the forest and across frozen fields. Inside, families and neighbors sat close together in the warmth, and someone would begin to tell a story. These stories explain the world: why the mountains stood where they did, why storms rolled across the sea, where the stars came from, stories about gods, stories about giants, stories about the beginning of everything. The same kind of stories may have been told in the hill forts as well, where people gather during times of danger or celebration. Imagine fires burning along the stone walls while people shared food and watched the darkness beyond the hills. Stories traveled easily in this world. They moved from farm to farm, from gathering to gathering, carried by memory rather than ink. No one wrote them down. They lived in voices, passed from parent to child, from elder to listener, from one generation to the next. And because they were told again and again over centuries, they slowly became part of the shared imagination of the North. Much later, in the 1200s, an Icelandic historian named Snorri Sturluson recorded many of these myths in writing. By the time Snorri wrote them down, the Viking Age had already passed. But the stories themselves were far older. They belonged to the worldview of people who lived centuries earlier, people whose lives were shaped by forests, farms, winter darkness, and the endless horizon of the sea. And one of the most powerful of the stories begins before there was land, before there was sky, before there was even a world. Now, I want to take you into one of those stories. Imagine standing in absolute emptiness. No land, no sky, no stars, just an endless void. In Norse mythology, this void is called Ginnungagap. To the north lay a realm of ice and mist. To the south burned a world of fire. For ages, these forces remained apart, but eventually, warmth touched the frozen north. Ice began to melt, and from that melting ice, life appeared. From the thawing ice emerged the first living being, a giant named Ymir. He was enormous, ancient, the first creature in existence. According to the myth, other giants formed from his body as he slept. Life multiplied from the giant, and nearby appeared a massive cow named Atumla. She licked the salty ice for nourishment. As she licked, another being slowly emerged from the ice, Buri, the ancestor of the gods. From Buri's descendants came three brothers, Odin, Vili, and V. The three brothers confronted Ymir. They murdered him. And then they did something extraordinary. They built the world from his body. His blood became the seas. His flesh became the earth. His bones became the mountains. His skull became the sky, and sparks from the realm of fire became the stars. Imagine hearing that story inside an Iron Age longhouse. Firelight flickering, wind moving outside, the entire universe explained through myth. But the Norse cosmos did not end there. At the center of the universe stood a vast tree, Yggdrasil, a great ash tree whose branches stretched across the heavens. Its roots reached into different realms of existence. The gods lived in one realm, humans in another, giants in another. Creatures moved along its branches. A great eagle perched at the top. A serpent gnawed at the roots. And a squirrel ran up and down the trunk carrying insults between them. The universe was alive, connected like the branches of a tree. Now, step back from the myth for a moment. We just heard a story about the creation of the world, giants forming from ice, a universe built from the body of Ymir, a cosmic tree holding the heavens together. These stories might sound distant or fantastical to us today, but for the people living in Iron Age Scandinavia, they were part of the same world we've been exploring throughout this episode. The farms, the forests, the iron tools, the hill forts watching the landscape. Mythology didn't exist somewhere separate from everyday life. It grew out of it. Imagine living in a world where storms arrive suddenly across the sea, where thunder shakes the sky, where winter darkness can last for months. In a world like that, it makes sense that people would imagine powerful beings behind those forces. Thunder might not just be the weather, it might be the sound of God's hammer. Mountains might not just be a rock. They might have once been part of a giant's body. The landscape itself becomes part of the story. Iron Age people would have looked at the world around them and seen meaning everywhere. The forest was not empty. It was filled with unseen beings. The sea was not just water. It was a place of power, danger, and connection. Even the sky had structure in these stories. The stars were not distant suns, they were sparks thrown into the heavens during the creation of the world. These myths help people organize reality. They helped answer questions that had no simple explanation. Why do storms happen? Where did the earth come from? Why does life exist at all? In a society without written science or formal philosophy, mythology became a way of thinking about the universe. But stories did something else too. They connected communities. When a story is shared, everyone listening becomes part of the same moment, the same memory, the same understanding of the world. And in some small Iron Age communities, that kind of shared understanding mattered because these were societies built on relationships, families working land together, neighbors defending settlements, communities gathering in places like hillforts during times of danger or celebration. Stories reinforced identity. They reminded people where they came from, who they were connected to, and how the world around them made sense. And because they were passed down through memory instead of writing, these stories were alive. Each storyteller carried them slightly different. One might add a new detail, another might emphasize a different moment, but the core of the myth remained recognizable. Over time, these stories spread across Scandinavia, across farms, across valleys, across coastlines, across generations. And eventually, centuries later, Snorri wrote some of them down. Stories from a world long ago, a world of Iron Age farmers and sailors, a world where iron tools were changing daily life, a world where communities gathered on hilltops and in longhouses, a world where people looked at forests, storms, mountains, and stars and tried to understand their place within it. The stories we now call Norse mythology were not invented all at once. They were shaped slowly across generations, carried in voices, changed by memory, and rooted deeply in the landscapes of Scandinavia. So when we hear those myths today, we are not just hearing stories about gods and giants. We are hearing reflections of the Iron Age world itself. The Iron Age world of Scandinavia was not yet the Viking Age, but the foundations were already forming. Farming communities, iron tools, ships moving across the Baltic, stories carried through generations, and slowly the societies of the North were becoming something new, something that would soon send ships across Europe. But that story comes next. For now, remember this: long before the Viking Age, long before sagas were written down, the people of Scandinavia were already shaping a world of iron, memory, and myth. And with that, we slowly step out of the Iron Age, out of the longhouses, out of the forests and hill forts, out of a world where iron tools were new, where farms dotted the landscapes, and where stories about giants and cosmic trees were carried from one generation to the next. For the people living in Scandinavia during this time, the future was still unwritten. They did not know that centuries later their descendants would sail across the seas in ships that the world would remember as Viking longships. They did not know their stories would survive long enough to be written down by the Icelandic writer Snorri Sturluson. They simply lived their lives in the landscapes we still recognize today, farming the land, traveling the waterways, and telling stories beside the fire. And those stories, carried by memories for centuries, are one of the reasons we can still glimpse their world today. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the Iron Age. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to keep exploring Sweden beyond the postcard image, I'd love for you to follow the podcast so you don't miss future episodes. Following the show really helps more people discover it, and it lets you know whenever a new episode comes out. And if you know someone who enjoys history, archaeology, or just discovering deeper stories behind the places we live in, feel free to share the podcast with them as well. In the next episode, we'll continue moving forward through time and begin exploring the world that eventually leads to the Viking Age, the ships, the trade routes, and the societies that were slowly forming around the Baltic Sea. But for now, imagine the fire burning low in a longhouse somewhere in Iron Age Scandinavia. Outside, the forest is dark, the wind moves through the trees, and inside, someone begins another story. Until next time, keep looking beyond the Swedish postcard.